Okay, super. So it's, again, my pleasure to welcome you to this, now the fourth edition of these reflections on faith and art, which we have been organizing as Pietra Viva, or Living Stones, together with the Center for Ignatian Spirituality in Malta. So in our last round of talks from last February, we explored the theme of anger and how it could be the fuel that that gets us to fight for justice as Christians and beyond. So that last round of talks ended by contemplating how the same fuel and fire could be, for justice could be signs of mercy, actually, Misericordia, and Caritas, charity, and actually God's mercy and charity. So this will be a good point, actually. Turned out to be a good point to start on for this round of talks. So for these talks, we'll be joined by today Giulia Privitelli, and in the coming weeks also have Professor Nadia Delicata, Professor Anthony Frendo, and Mr. Mark Kakia. So yeah, as I said, the theme is mercy. And picking up from that last note of the last round of talks. So acts of mercy have been a key element of Christian teachings from the very beginning. And so intrinsic are they to this mission statement that I think one set of Bible verses that says this out. There's no more of a clear statement, I think, than Matthew's vision of the Last Judgment. As the returning king, son of man, makes the statement, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." It's from Matthew 25. Of course, this even written well over 2,000 years ago. This judgment and mission are still as relevant today as they've ever been. With too many, I say, of our brothers and sisters in unjust situations that demand and really need our compassion and mercy. So, as has always been the case with these talks, we'll start with point of reflection on a piece of art, and this time it's Caravaggio's Sette, Opere, della Misericordia, 7 works of mercy, which our friends from Naples have the privilege of being able to see in person, just like we are able to see some of other of the artist's works here in Malta. It's this piece is a beautiful and characteristically, I'd say, dramatic representation of this mercy, showing the 7 traditional Catholic acts that are based on the same Bible verses I mentioned, from Matthew's Gospel. So I won't keep you for long today. We have Miss Giulia Privitelli, an art historian who studied the theology of art, who's also from our community of Pietra Viva, though currently, maybe she'll go into it a bit. Currently in Amsterdam, not Malta, on a little bit of a project we're working on. And today she'll be introducing the painting itself, and going into the symbols shown and exploring the work as a text for spiritual reflection. So, Giulia, over to you.
All right, thank you. You want to go ahead and continue? I'm joking. No, actually, I do want to thank also the Pietra Viva community in Naples, because quite a lot of what I will be sharing with you today actually is also they're sharing with me, especially of Caterina, but we'll get into that later. So first, I'm going to share my screen. All right. So yes, as also Thomas has very clearly set it out, there is a continuation from last February's theme on anger, but there is also a continuation in the selection of the work of art, which will guide us to reflect on this year's theme on mercy. Among those of you who were present last year, you will remember that the reference image was this one here that you can see. Christ's cleansing of the temple by Giotto di Bondone, and this is one of the cycle of frescoes in the Scrovegni Chapel in Padova. It's also referred to as the Arena Chapel. But last year, we noted this connection between the fresco and the representations of the Last Judgment, actually. And we also observed how important it was to reflect on the context, on the contextual placement, even artistic placement of the cycle of frescoes, of Christ's anger, which is represented here, as a turning point within the larger narrative of salvation. And this was important to understand mostly the difference between the expressed anger of Christ and that of the crowd. We saw how the ever-creative God offers the space to transform, really, the anger of the crowd, which is our own anger, of course, into the possibility for new life, indeed for recreation. So in a way, the self-emptying of Christ confronts the empty anger of man, transforming emptiness and empty promises into a hopeful one, into a hopeful promise of man's liberation and reconciliation within himself, with creation, and ultimately also with God. But for this round of talks, this time we will take Caravaggio's iconic work of Le Sette, Opere, della Misericordia, which is at the Piemonte della Misericordia in Naples, as we've already mentioned, which was painted around 300 years after the cycle of frescoes of Giotto. And this time we won't be exploring the connection between divine anger, judgment, and mercy, but rather to explore the next step, which is that of mercy as a creative act. So merciful love is, in essence, creative love, also as Pope St. John Paul II would put it. It's also quite a coincidence, a good one, that on the World Day of Prayer for Creation back in 2016, Pope Francis actually referred to the care for creation as a new work of mercy, which complements and builds on the existing traditional works of mercy. But of course, before we get to this 8th act of mercy, that is the care for creation, before we can even understand what this call to creation has to do with mercy, we have to first look at the 7 traditional ones, of course. We won't be really looking into the moral aspect of this. This will be tackled by Professor Nadia Delicata, or even biblical theology, that's Professor Anthony will do, Anthony Frendo. But although, yes, of course, they are present, so I will make some references, but these will be highlighted later in the next weeks, every Friday. So we will rather try to tackle this idea through art, of course, particularly the work of Caravaggio, and the cultural and socio-political circumstances that of the artist, which actually made and necessitated that such a work would be made. Okay, so we'll be looking at it more from an artistic point of view. But we cannot begin without referring, of course, to the biblical passage that also Thomas referred to, which is most often quoted as the source for the 7 acts of mercy, or rather the 6 acts of mercy. I'll get into that shortly. As I just mentioned, also today's starting point was what was the reference image earlier on in February, because in February we also made this reference to practically to this gospel, to this chapter, to Matthew 25. I'll read through it a bit because some parts I will actually highlight because we'll see how they also emerge in the painting itself. Probably you can already arrive to some conclusions as I read. So it'll be interesting to hear also your comments at the end. So it reads like this. But when the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, Then he will sit on the throne of his glory. This is already something to remark on. Sit on the throne of his glory. Before him, all the nations will be gathered, and he will separate them one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. Then the king will tell those on the right hand, "Come, blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." So from the very start. Also keep this in mind because I will refer to the book of Genesis, okay? Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me food to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you took me in. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. And it continues. Then the righteous will answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you a drink? When did we see you a stranger and take you in, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? The king will then answer them, most certainly I tell you, because you did it, one of the least of these of my brothers, you did it to me. Then he will also say to those on the left hand, depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire, which is prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, etc., etc., etc. Then they will also answer saying, but Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and didn't help you? Then he will answer them saying, most certainly I tell you, because you did not do it to one of the least of these, you didn't do it to me. So also this question, when did we see you? Keep this also in mind. So taken in this context of Jesus's teaching on justice and divine judgment, as explained in the division of the sheep and the goats, the corporeal works of mercy may actually be understood as a channel of grace. So in the sense that they are good deeds, and thus ultimately a work of justice, which is pleasing to God, as we have read over here. Pleasing, but in the same sense as we also find it in creation, in the book of Genesis, where God saw that what he had created is good. So keep this in mind, okay, especially for later on. So the 7 acts of mercy was painted in a kind of self-imposed exile. Indeed, apparently it was the first one that Caravaggio painted after he had killed a man in Rome, mercilessly, you can say, in an untempered rush of anger and agitation. And this coincidentally continues driving one of the main points raised this February, that just anger brought on by the deviation from what is good must always be coupled with mercy if it is to be really a transformative and creative act. Otherwise, it would be simply destructive. So it was, for Caravaggio, it was during this delicate time in Naples, as a criminal hunted by the law, that incredibly he managed to receive a commission from the confraternity of the Piemonte della Misericordia for a high altarpiece of its church. And this is the one you see here on the screen. Now, the confraternity that commissioned the altarpiece was a relatively new one in Naples. It was founded in 1602 by 7 noble Neapolitans, and it was dedicated to the practice of the 7 acts of corporal mercy. So, of course, the altarpiece highlights also the mission of this confraternity, of course. It might be worth pointing out that this is also to be seen in the context of counter-reformatory Europe, 16th century, 17th century. which means to be actively participant in faith, to express faith through works is necessary. It matters, for it involves a movement or a progression towards what is good, what is beautiful, what is true. So it is a kind of active waiting for salvation, where solo fides non basta, so where faith alone is actually not enough. And therefore, this is a kind of anti-Protestant polemic, okay? The emphasis on the acts of mercy. So in medieval churches, for example, the Counter-Reformation churches, like the medieval churches, also stress the belief that charitable acts could prepare humanity for salvation. And it is no coincidence that on portals of several medieval churches, like the one you see here, this is the Gallup's Porta in the Munster at Basel, or even an earlier representation. This is Antelami's relief for the Parma baptistry, the west doors, and on the jambs of the door you can see these acts, these 6 different acts of mercy. We find such representations which are associated also to the Last Judgment. And other topics might also include the 10 wise or foolish virgins. So these topics are many times connected to the theme of the Last Judgment, and to the idea that to enter through the door, that is Christ, to enter into the heavenly Jerusalem, one must bring the oil of his or her lamp, which is the labor and essence of one's life, okay, one's work to the door. Now, the portico of the Church of Piemonte della Misericordia, I've been told by Caterina, is architecturally very uncommon to find in Naples. And also, it doesn't have any such decoration like the ones I've just mentioned, but its function nonetheless carries a similar meaning. The function of the portico, which again is architecturally not very common in Naples, at least at the time, the function of the portico is really to receive and offer some kind of shelter to the one who is outside, that is the pilgrim or the stranger, the criminal, but also literally the one who is outside the church, that is the one who approaches and waits at the gate of divine mercy. Furthermore, the chapel itself was only later increased in size. So initially, the altar and the Caravaggio altarpiece, of course, would have appeared to be close to the door, as if the painting itself could be the door through which one must pass. So the door of the 7 acts of mercy. Now, 6 of these corporeal acts, as we've just read, actually derive from the gospel passage, which is associated with the Last Judgment. And each of these 6 acts, as well as bury your dead, we'll get into this very soon, but that's not mentioned in the gospel. That was later introduced in medieval tradition. These 6 acts are all very clearly depicted, or rather not very clearly, actually, quite ambiguous. But in any case, they are all represented in Caravaggio's very densely congested depiction of the topic, where each figure actually may be read in light of 2 acts. Okay, so one group of figures can be seen to kind of represent 2 acts of mercy. And we will begin with the 7th act, which was added to the canon later on in the Middle Ages, actually. And it also seems to hold the climax of the entire painting, at least in the bottom section of the painting. As you can see, emerging from behind the corner, part of a corpse wrapped in white cloth can be seen, seemingly in procession with a priest who is dressed in white and wielding this burning torch. Now, the seventh act is not really referred to in the gospel, as I just mentioned, but it is in a way often alluded to. It's referred to and also praised, especially in the manner, perhaps you can think of in the manner in which Christ's own body is treated with expensive oils, as recounted in all the four gospels, and ultimately in the way it is laid to rest in the tomb offered by a wealthy man, the Sanhedrin, Joseph of Arimathea. The seventh act, furthermore, is also referred to in the book of Tobias in the Old Testament, which coincidentally, or perhaps not so much, was not recognized as canon, as part of the books of the Old Testament by the Protestants. So once again, it could be here a very tongue-in-cheek way of attacking the Protestants. Well, in any case, in front of this scene then is a female figure suckling a prisoner from her breast. This scene, of course, summarizes the act of feeding the hungry. I will elaborate more on this because it also might refer to the third act, now visiting the prisoners. And it actually reminds us, it would iconographically as well, to the allegory of Caritas Romana, Roman charity, which in turn is based on the legend of Simon and his daughter Pero. Now, according to the legend of Simon and Pero, the judges of Simon, because Simon was a prisoner, he was in prison, and Pero would visit her father constantly and provide him with food. So the judges of this person, Simon, were in such admiration of this display of Pero, so this display of self-giving love, really, that both of them, both Simon and his daughter, after they were caught, were actually pardoned. So this is very interesting, I think. So moving on. In the background, once again, to the left, you can see highlighted over here is another man, a figure, who is kind of guzzling down water from a jawbone. Probably this is a reference to Samson, as we read in the book of Judges, chapter 15, who was delivered from his thirst after pleading with God. His strength then returned, and furthermore, he then judged Israel for 20 years. So again, there's this connection between mercy and judgment. Then immediately in front of him, we have a pilgrim, or two actually, who is characterized here by his staff and the iconic shell on his hat. These are the pilgrim staff and the pilgrim hat, no? And he is addressing what is probably an innkeeper, who probably also indicates the way to a shelter. No, actually, as pilgrims, there are two. I don't know if you can see it, but behind this man in the front, there's another section which is highlighted, and all you can see is an ear. That's because the second pilgrim is actually almost completely hidden. But if you look closely, he's actually there, okay? Meanwhile, at the very front, we have here a nearly naked man, almost completely naked, who receives a piece of red fabric that is cut from the cloak of a man who stands right next to him. And this is possibly a reference to Saint Martin of Tours. Meanwhile, the naked figure, we cannot identify who it is because his face is turned away from us. So he is anonymous. Now, this is quite important also because to be naked, to be without clothes, is not simply a material kind of poverty, but it's also something that has to do with us, no, with our spiritual poverty. So a kind of spiritual nakedness. It's to be without an identity, essentially, to be without a face, to be without a name. To be purely a number. I think Father Mark Kakia will enter into this later on in the fourth session. So when it comes to social justice and mercy. So to clothe or to reinvest one with dignity, and which allows one to stand again on his or her feet, would therefore also refer to perhaps the cripple. In fact, some also analyze this, the naked man here who is receiving this garment. They notice that his foot is also lit up. So this makes us think that perhaps he could also represent a cripple, even the way his posture is, as if he cannot really move. Okay, so furthermore, this would then condense this group of figures once again, signifying two acts. So clothing the naked and visiting the sick or the cripple. But if we look a bit closer, actually, at the lower left-hand side, you can see here another foot. I had to change a lot here, dramatically change the contrast of the painting so that you can see it. It's probably intentional that in real life, this you cannot see. We'll get into this later on. So this foot, okay, which probably it does belong to another person, but who is completely shrouded in the dark. So as it were, it is in the deepest and most absolute darkness, really, hidden from sight. There is a beggar, someone who is asking for help. So, and in fact here, perhaps right beneath the blade, there is also these crossed hands, as if pleading for alms or some kind of food or a piece of the cloth. So right beneath the tip of the mantle of Saint Martin of Tours. So this man also who represents Saint Martin, actually, he doesn't really look at the person who is receiving the clothes, but into this dark space. So he seemingly also seems perhaps to be paying attention to what is hardly visible, this cripple, ill-looking presence in the shadows. So having gone through these 7 acts, actually some questions may start to emerge just by observing how Caravaggio treats these 7 acts pictorially. So in the bottom scene, as a whole, there is no real clear point of focus, okay? But one of the acts, that is visiting and tending to the sick, is almost completely set in the dark, hidden from view. Okay, so there's this strange, like things which are completely hidden from our view. And at the same time, we also have this torch, which attracts our attention. In fact, this visual emphasis of this torch held by the priest, referring to the burial of the dead, and perhaps then also on the group right in front of it, because our eyes now are in that part of the painting. So the 2 acts here which show the burial of the dead, but also visiting the people in prison or feeding the hungry. So to perform charitable acts with those in prison seems to be emphasized somehow. Maybe, but of course we cannot confirm this, but might Caravaggio actually be contemplating his own crime, which ended up in the death of a person, a crime punishable not only by imprisonment, but also in death itself. So maybe this is a bit of projecting here, but perhaps Caravaggio here was also contemplating that his own reality, no? So in fact, I remind you, Caravaggio was a fugitive from the law at the time of his brief stay in Naples, because he had just killed a man in Rome. And more so, scientific studies of the painting show that it was painted in a rush. So it was painted quite quickly because there are very few over paintings. And over paintings are generally done when an artist rethinks what they have done. No, so this is also curious that we're talking here about action, and there are not many overpaintings which show that Caravaggio was rethinking his own action, but mostly because there wasn't time. Again, he was a fugitive. But anyway, it might be quite futile to ask such questions, and the answer, if there is one, will probably not change much of what we matters to us in this in our case. For us, what matters for now is that Caravaggio chooses to light the torch on the dark alleys of 16th century Naples, where crimes, illnesses, and material deprivation equally plague every human being, every human person. So perhaps this is the main really interpretative key to understand then the hidden figure in the bottom right corner, and the main invitation of the altarpiece, that although those who hold a torch on their good actions might be more visible, those who are hidden from view are just as worthy of our attention, if not, in fact, even more effort has to be done. So even the crippled figure in the dark, who is barely visible here, ends up a way really to read the entire work of art. So to pay attention to what is not immediately visible to the eyes, recalling again what we read in Matthew 25, no? When did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and we didn't help you? So the greatest act of charity is really perhaps towards that which is truly hidden, those people who are truly hidden, not those who cry out about their suffering, about their pain, about their poverty, but those that actually hide away, those that actually hide their wounds. So the revealing light descends on the scene through a source other than the torch, this material torch, as if the light, this light which descends on the scene actually refers to some other kind of gaze, and it lights up the extent of man's need for salvation, the extent of our need for an intercessor, for the deliverance of salvation through divine mercy. And in fact, the painting too suggests that those who are actually giving or performing an act of charity are actually themselves seemingly in need of as much mercy and charity. I mean, if you look closely at their faces, they all seem to be quite distressed and in tension. So it's curious that those who are also providing the help are perhaps themselves seeking help. But we have here perhaps another question. Why would there be need of divine intervention, divine intercession at all, if we are talking about good acts? No, it might seem to be a bit of a contradiction. Why, if things are, if good acts are being offered, why would there be need of someone to intercede on their behalf? So a hint might be taken by observing the upper portion of the painting. And here especially I would once again like to thank my dear friend from Naples and also from Pietravive, Caterina, who also is more qualified to speak about this painting than I am. But her thoughts helped me shape my own. And incredibly, we also arrived to a similar understanding of this artwork, but from different angles, so to speak. So focusing on these two angels, who seem to be locked in an embrace. No? They seem to be hugging one another. But at the same time, they also seem to be struggling. It's very ambiguous, which is also very typical of what Caravaggio usually does in his work. And a curious detail, which is maybe a little bit more than just a curiosity, is that the wings of the angel on the right are actually white. Meanwhile, and not because they are lit up, because as I just mentioned, the light source seems to be coming from somewhere else, not the torch, which is right beneath these wings. So they are white because they have been painted to represent white. Meanwhile, the angel on the left then, who seems to be kind of restrained by the angel with the white wings, his wings are actually much darker. So could we here perhaps draw a link to the biblical passage that we read earlier, Matthew 25, that is of what concerns the division between those who are on the left, the condemned, and those on the right? Perhaps. What seems to be clear is that it is not a question of light, given that the way the entire scene is actually illuminated. This angel with the dark wings seems also to be quite shocked at what is happening beneath. He extends an arm as if to rush to the aid of the people beneath, to aid the people in the streets. And once again, it would echo the question, but aren't these corporeal acts of charity? So why would there be need for some kind of spiritual intercession? So is this angel interceding after all, or is he trying to disturb the people on the street to stop them, maybe? What is happening here? So if we consider the other angel, so the angel on the right, who is trying to restrain the other, the confusion is increased a bit, because one can no longer really distinguish between good and evil, good and bad. And this is kind of emphasized as well, because I don't know if you can see it, but there's this white strip between the two. It's part of a white sheet, which at some point also becomes black as it falls on the people beneath. And the people beneath are completely unaware of what is happening above, this kind of spiritual battle. Again, so it is not really a matter of illumination, of light or shadow, which Caravaggio is, of course, a great master of, chiaroscuro. But it's not a matter of this, because the light which is coming from the torch is having no effect really on the angels above. So the light is indeed coming from somewhere else. So the question is, why are these angels struggling? And why is it also so unclear as to what they represent, good or evil, or both? So why does the angel with white wings seemingly want to restrain the other, as if also stopping a grace or a gift, while the angel with the darker wings seems to also be preoccupied with what is happening beneath? Maybe this could be an invitation to actually consider what we think of acts of mercy, or rather than to think about the act itself, to consider better the intention behind these acts. So that is, this would lead us to see them perhaps in a more negative light, no? Depending on the intentions that inspired that act or gesture. So it is as if the work itself is a reflection that goes really to the very beginning, to the origin, to the intention, which brings a person to perform acts of charity. So it's not just about the doing, but it's also about why we do what we do. It is, in fact, as we read in Matthew 25, which also gives attention to this fact, to the intention behind the acts of charity, that is to do things freely, without strings attached, as we say. So without keeping the other person kind of bound and hostage, really, to our goodness, to our acts of charity. So an act of charity, depending on the intention behind it, could be interpreted as good or evil, good or, rather than evil, good or negative, let's say that. But again, it's hardly ever so clear cut, where an intention comes from. So, for example, and Caravaggio seems to play with this ambiguity, of course. So, for example, here, if you look at the woman in the foreground, in the act which shows the feeding of the hungry or visiting the people in prison, you might also question, like, why is her dress drawn in this way? You know, why is it being lifted in such a revealing way, to expose her nudity? Why is it such a provocative suggestion, let's say? In the same way, we can also have a look here at Saint Martin of Tours, where his gesture can be interpreted in two ways, really, as if he is about to cut the hem of the cloth of the mantle to offer to the naked man, or perhaps that he is holding on to the mantle, pulling it away from the naked man. So this would be an attitude of a man who does not want to be disturbed in the end. So in the same way, it's also quite uncertain what the innkeeper is really doing. You know, if he's actually pointing the way or out of the canvas, like, is he actually greeting them into the shelter, or telling them, no, it's full up, there's no room here, go on, go ahead. Meanwhile, the pilgrim too is holding the staff, as you can see, maybe if you peer closer to the screens. The staff is being held as if like a shield, like in defense, rather than as a walking stick. So, and curiously enough, this very strange illuminated ear, like, why did Caravaggio decide to leave this ear illuminated? Bang in the middle of the painting. It's as if this ear of the second pilgrim, who is hidden, almost completely hidden behind the figure of Saint Martin, this ear is given even more prominence, no? As if it were really an invitation to listen, to discern the intentions embedded deep in the actions of each person. Every good action, every act of love ultimately can be perverted if the intent is not a healthy one. And so it is by this measure that in the end, our actions will be judged. So in fact, the image of the Madonna of Mercy as a protector of the people and also as an intercessor, which, by the way, increased tremendously during the late 14th and 15th century, especially in reactions to fears of the plague. For example, usually images of the Madonna of Mercy, such as here, they were frequently employed in plague-related altarpieces, but they also usually they simply show the Madonna of Mercy is usually iconographically shown embracing people under the hem of her cloth. And here is another example from Benedetto Bonfigli. But she also, usually, the Madonna of Mercy is sometimes also represented as someone who intercedes on behalf of the people and appearing as an intercessor to Christ at the Last Judgment, pleading her son to give mercy to the judged. And here we find an example by Federico Fiori Barocci, the Madonna del Popolo. So this is called the iconography of the Madonna Mediatrix type, where the Virgin actually occupies an intermediary space between heaven and earth. And often, as we can see, especially in Barocci's altarpiece, she also gestures to the people below, no? And also at the same time to Christ in pleading looks of mercy. So her placement here references, of course, the Last Judgment even more explicitly. And so it also echoes this deep, deep theology behind the title of Mary as Our Lady of Mercy, or the Mother of Divine Mercy. And in fact, as explained also, elaborated further in the Second Vatican Council, we read as follows, Lumen Gentium: being assumed into heaven, She has not laid aside the office of salvation, but by her manifold intercession, she continues to obtain for us the graces of eternal salvation. By her maternal charity, she takes care of the brethren of her Son, who still journey on earth, surrounded by dangers and difficulties until they are led into their blessed home. So the only thing in the painting which is without doubt a representation of good, no question about that, is actually maternal love, the love of a mother to a child. So this is the place of stillness between the struggle, indeed between the two angels. So the love between the virgin and the child, the maternal love which is completely free, no strings attached, a true act of self-gift, which is embodied here in the figure of the Virgin. So the purest and clearest act of charity, which seems to be quite immune to the struggle itself, to this ambiguity, to this uncertainty, which otherwise fills the rest of the entire painting. So her gaze towards the whole world beneath is, as you can see, a very preoccupied one, almost one that suggests even greater awareness and attention to the works in our daily life. So indeed, between the angels, between this mixture of good and evil, of good and bad, good and negative, is the figure of a female holding a child. The faces of the woman and the child themselves are also a bit curious, maybe not what we would expect. For example, the child, who here, of course, represents Jesus, the child seems sick, and he even has this strange coloring on his face. It's as if he's burnt or swollen, I don't know, stained somehow. And also the woman herself, her face, her eyes, they're hollow with these lines, the deep lines beneath her eyes, which usually is a sign of exhaustion, of sadness. And she holds this child as she shows him the very depraved conditions of the people below. So meanwhile, the child too is ill and poor. Iconographically, the Virgin of Mercy, as I said, usually offers her dress or mantle or veil. I showed you first the picture, a representation of the rendition of Piero della Francesca at Borgo San Sepolcro, as if you know the way she holds her dress is almost like a tent covering all these people, almost like a shelter. But if we look at Caravaggio's work here, once again, there is something like a mantle. Here you see this white cloth billowing. And not only that, but it gradually descends downwards and it actually changes color. It turns black, okay, as it descends down into the darkness below. And then finally turns up again as this red mantle, which is thrown over the shoulder of Saint Martin of Tours, who then in turn offers it to the naked man, to mankind, really and truly. So it is as if grace, so the color white, descends into the so-called filth below, so into blackness, into the poverty, becoming incarnate. So it becomes red, incarnate, even cardium, and it's the color itself is red. And finally, so you have this progression, from white to black to red. And finally, it's offered also to mankind. And this is itself the process of incarnation. That is the word becoming flesh, God descending to earth. And so the incarnation actually might be the entire point, the ultimate act of charity and self-gift. God touches the poverty of mankind. So God descending into this poverty, becoming the poor, sickly child that we see in the painting, and also of whom we read in the Gospels, the criminal who took on the sins and evils of mankind, criminal between inverted commas, of course, who took on the sins and the evils of mankind, was crucified in order to cleanse us of those same sins and evils, to restore then humanity back to God, to restore humanity with dignity. So the painting is a reminder somehow of one's own poverty, really, of one's afflicted and sinful condition since the very beginning, as in the Genesis. That is, to sin, to distance oneself from the source of love, of charity, is to be poor. Okay. Perhaps this tension between acts of charity, of self-gift and of repenting, primarily stemmed from Caravaggio's own personal and conflicted condition, as we've been mentioning, who was, of course, equally wanted for his art and also for his crimes. It's a massive paradox, Caravaggio, who was wanted both for what he could create, but also for what he destroyed, so to speak. But not only, because Caravaggio, as all artists do, or try to do at least, is to see things differently. So Caravaggio could very likely see in the poverty of daily life in the streets of Napoli, and perhaps in his own life, the greatness and grace of God. So the upper part of the painting, the Virgin and Child and the angels, is apparently not visible to the people below. Yet those who do see the painting, that is us observing the painting from the outside, we can see it all happen, unfold before us. So who sees this painting, which is after all an altarpiece, sees also what happens on the altar. No, we see the sacrifice that happens on the altar with every single Mass. Yeah, this is the celebration of the Eucharist, that is the ultimate act of mercy. No, and let us once again remember the context of the Counter-Reformation, in which the true presence of Christ in the Eucharist was challenged. Actually, it was attacked. And it is precisely on that altar where something so poor, like a piece of unleavened bread, no yeast, because there was no time to prepare bread in the correct way, referring to the Exodus. So something as poor as a piece of unleavened bread can become the body of Christ, the body of God, so that the infant child, Jesus, was born into extreme poverty and simplicity, is the same Christ Jesus who completely offers himself up in an act of self-gift. So the one who is able to perceive the greatness of God, the greatness of self-gift in the poverty of this Eucharistic meal of bread and wine, can therefore also see, once the Mass has ended, the greatness of God and mercy, his greatness and mercy precisely in daily life, on the streets of Naples of 16th, 17th century, and also the impoverished people who inhabit them. So Caravaggio's technique actually really helps us to make this link. The painting's realismo, as they say, it's realism, lends itself well. So to the view that the work here is almost as an extension, it can be seen as an extension of the bustling streets of Naples of the early 17th century. In fact, one commenter of this work, Prose, says this: with its teeming composition set in a nocturnal streetscape, the altarpiece may make you feel as if the cyclonic street life of the city has somehow followed you inside church. And it is perhaps also for this reason that the confraternity which commissioned this painting mentioned that it should never be removed from its position, its perpetual immovability, we would read, where the architecture, the context is completely complements and is inseparable from this extraordinary pictorial work. So the gaze of Caravaggio brings us as the viewers to see differently. Now, if we allow it to, it could transform our gaze into one which we become aware of what the characters in the painting do not themselves seem to be aware of. It invites us to see what is hidden, inviting us therefore to adopt the gaze of God. And so ultimately, it lifts our gaze into this higher act of mercy, which is God's incarnation and descent into the world, into the troubles and suffering of the people. And as another commentator argues, Pacelli, it is not with Caravaggio a question of verisimilitude or mere imitation, things seem, but dogged and aimed at encompassing all aspects, here reaching sublime heights, to visualize the world in quite a new way. And this new way actually points to an even greater realism and naturalism than the painting itself, which actually, when you think about it, the painting is really quite unrealistic, no? Everything congested into such a tight, small space. And so it points to a deeper and richer kind of truthfulness, to a greater realism, which cannot simply be obtained by focusing on the specific details of the painting. So it's a realism you get when you step away. So to see anew is, after all, a kind of conversion. I quote here Pope St. John Paul II, who says, "Conversion to God is always the fruit of the rediscovery of the Father, who is rich in mercy." So this idea of transforming the gaze, okay? So we must step away and put some distance between us and the painting. We must, in fact, really stand at the door of the church, between the earthly streets of daily life and the heavenly realm, the promise of the celestial Jerusalem, of this merciful Father. There at the door, the pivot of mercy and the site of revelation is the Christ, who tells to his disciples and those who accuse and question God, the Father of compassion, he tells them, "Go and learn what this means, that I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Okay, so finally, we turn from artwork to the streets, where God is always constantly faithful, and therefore he is always present. And it takes place not as a singular moment, but as an attitude, an act of continuous conversion, called by and towards mercy. So ultimately, the meaning, or rather the reminder, may be that everybody can partake in this reality of mercy. Even today, in our contemporary cultures and in our societies, such a painting is really able to transform our gaze. So it's not just early 17th century Napoli that is called to this transformation of the gaze. Why? In order to identify God's timeless mercy in this world. So as it was in the 17th century, so it is now, to be participants in this divine mercy, which is kind of echoed in these corporeal acts of mercy. Now, to conclude, we reflected on the corporeal works of mercy as we see in Caravaggio's painting. I can finally now turn back to something that we mentioned at the very beginning, that is Pope Francis's proclamation that the care of creation is a new work of mercy. It is so because ultimately it is also based on the same gestures which, I quote him, break the logic of violence, exploitation, and selfishness, and makes itself felt in every action that seeks to build a better world. So, in other words, it is based on the gesture that seeks to approach good, that responds to the call to leave the table of exploitation and selfishness, and towards that which engenders and sustains life. And so here I will just very briefly refer to another work by Caravaggio, which you all know very well, I'm sure. I will not go into detail, as that would take us another whole hour, I think, but I will only highlight one thing, which may help us reflect a bit more on this idea of creation through mercy, as something which is already manifested in the book of Genesis and from the very foundation of the world, and requalified then through the incarnation of Christ. I mean, we've been referring also to the Gospel of Matthew, and this is a scene which refers to the calling of Matthew. And looking at this painting without going into the merits of who Saint Matthew is in this painting, it helps at the same time to remember what actually follows this scene in which Christ calls Levi, who then is given the new name of Matthew. Following the scene of the calling, Christ then dines. He has a meal at the house of Levi, of Matthew. And doing so, he is actually accused by the Pharisees of dining with tax collectors and sinners. This is from Matthew chapter 9, by the way. And we know what Christ replies. As we've already read this, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. So Matthew's call also tells us something about divine mercy, although it's not directly related to the subject of the 7 acts of mercy. It nonetheless has something to say to us about the connection between mercy and creation. And there is perhaps no other detail that draws this link better than the hand of Christ. This, as probably you recognize, is not just any hand, but it is the hand of Adam, lifted from Michelangelo's rendition of the creation of Adam in the Sistine Chapel, the Vatican. But here is the hand of Adam in the position of God's, no? For it belongs to the new Adam, the Son of God incarnate, who calls and recreates those he calls, gives them a new name, bestowing them with a new name. So the distance between the hand of Christ and Matthew, between the sheep and the goats, the innkeeper and the pilgrim, the distance between the clothed and the naked man, the food and the hungry, the water and the thirsty, the free and the prisoner, the healer and the sick, between life and death, the painter's brush and the bare canvas, or the bare wall, if it's a fresco, that space is an act of is the possibility for creation. So the creative gesture, we could say, is the place of mercy, no? Which acts against what is poor, what is impoverished, without face, without identity, without hope or dignity. So how else could we understand what Pope Francis said when he said that it doesn't make sense to give polluted water to who is thirsty? He says that first we must clean it. So the purification of that water is really the same purification, the same baptism, if you wish, that the body and soul undergo with each performed act of mercy. It's like to receive new life each time. They flow from the same source of blessing that creates and makes things good. Acts of mercy flow from memory. They are an expression of a moved heart, misericordium, the heart which is in mercy, which is moved. They result in things which are made new constantly and are therefore part of a great narrative of creation, and especially of mankind's redemption, of mankind's return to the Father, and our discovery that ultimately we are an image, a good image, made in the image and likeness of a maker, as also Tolkien would say. And this good image, actually, to which we all may aspire, becomes even more clear when a mirror or an altarpiece, like Caravaggio's masterpiece, showing precisely the impoverished condition of mankind is held up to us, like a mirror. And we can therefore see ourselves among the protagonists. If we were living in the 17th century, this is the clothing that we would wear. And so among them, along with the protagonists, we are called to act mercifully without intent of reward, and especially with those who are most difficult to see, there in the left bottom corner, which is hidden from view and from earshot. And even then, even if we are the ones who are providing some form of help, even then, I imagine we ought to recognize that we ourselves are in need of just as much mercy. Okay, and with this, I conclude here. Thank you for your attention. I know it's quite late, but I don't know if there are time for questions or clarifications. So I will allow Thomas to take the stand again.
Thank you so much, Julia. Wonderful reflection as always. So yeah.
Thank you.